Hello, everybody. Hopefully you guys can hear me all right. If you can, let me know in the comments. Welcome to yet another live photo editing session. My name is Mike Davies, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to edit this photo that you see here. This is a photo that I took probably 2 weeks ago now. Another one of my favorites. Maybe it was last week. I can't remember. But yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite photos for sure, but I'm going to be showing you guys how to, do the usual photo editing process, and then we're going to get a little bit into some color gradients here using some layer modes, and I think a lot of you guys are already familiar with some of those concepts there. And hopefully you guys can see this live stream. Hopefully you guys are in the proper location. Looks like, yeah, there we go. We got some people joining us now. Sounds good. Good evening, Ano. Thank you for joining me. So, of course, before we dive into the tutorial today, I just want to quickly direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, we have tons of GIMP video and text tutorials on here, so definitely check that out. You can enroll in my best-selling GIMP 2.10 photo editing course from beginner to pro photo retoucher. I recently renamed this to my GIMP 2.10 photo editing masterclass. We're over 18 hours of content now, so I figured it was fair to call it the masterclass. So definitely check that out, and I have a discount link in the description of this video and all my videos, so you won't pay that price right there. And you guys can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon and get some awesome GIMP extras in return. Most recently, I have added some content here, including an exclusive photo editing tutorial for my prepare for print tutorial that I put out recently. So I just put out a tutorial on how to prepare your images for print, and I mentioned in that tutorial that I had edited the image, but I hadn't included it as part of that tutorial, so I did it on Patreon as an exclusive tutorial. So you'll get access to that as well as news and updates and things of that nature. All right, so let's head over to the comments section. Fedora, thanks for joining us from Algeria. And Ano from the Netherlands. And thank you, Alberto, for confirming you can hear me. Appreciate that. And hello, Victor from Brazil. All right, so here is my photo here. This is of the amazing Gabriella. And thank you, Ano. I'm glad you enjoyed that print tutorial. That was actually one that I had received a request for from Simon, and that was from my contact form on my website, daviesmediadesign.com. Let me flash that graphic up on there again. So yeah, I don't always have time to get to all of the submissions that go through there. I do get a lot of emails, but occasionally I do get a really awesome submission request, and I do my best to try to satisfy those requests. And in this case, I happen to be able to create a tutorial for that request. Thanks for joining, Bob, from the States, from Maryland. Appreciate that. My fellow American. And all right, so I'm going to get started here. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be getting into a little bit of using color gradients and layer modes, and I'll get into why I did that. And so here we have an image, and this was the original, and I do have the original image for download on my Flickr page. I'm going to start putting all my photos onto Flickr just because it does allow you to have a Creative Commons license on that, and that helps protect my images from people trying to steal them and sell them. So I do have that link in the description, so you guys can download this image and follow along. It's a pretty large image to start with. We're going to scale it down, but I cropped this image, and I don't think I scaled this one actually because this one's still pretty large. But what I did was, because there's like a red building back here, I decided to accentuate the red from the building by adding a red gradient to the bottom. And part of the reason I did that, not only to match the colors, but also because I thought the gray down here looked a little bit boring. It doesn't look terrible, honestly, but I thought that it just looked a little bit cooler having a little bit of red, a splash of red going on at the bottom, and it almost looks like there's some red light coming from behind the camera or something, so I just thought that created a cool effect. And I used a flash for this photo. You guys can actually see the lens I used and the settings I used on my camera, and whether or not I had a flash, all on the Flickr page. So that's another cool thing about Flickr, is it gives you some details about, the tech aspects of my camera and, all my settings and all that. And I also took this photo in the morning, so this is using morning light. This was right before sunset, and Gabriella, the model, was a good sport because it was really freezing that day, and she was being real flexible about it. So anyway, enough blabbing on about the photo. Let's get into the actual photo editing. So I mentioned that I didn't scale this in the original. I'm going to start with my scaling and cropping, so I'll grab my crop tool, and I have my fixed aspect ratio option checked. I don't know if I'm actually going to use this, but I'm going to switch it over to portrait mode as opposed to landscape. And then I'm going to click and drag my crop and maybe hold control and zoom in a bit. And I'm going to make sure I get a little bit of my building. And I actually am going to uncheck this aspect ratio. And I'm just going to crop this based on, what I like inside of the photo. So you'll see there's some cool lights going on here, and they almost look like they're infinitely going into the background because they were reflecting off the glass, and there's, different lights one after the other behind here. So it created this really cool like infinity effect here in the photo. So I'm just going to make sure she's nice and centered, and by the way, I have my rule of thirds guide set here. And thanks for joining us, Al from New York. And I appreciate the positive words there. That's awesome. Thank you for following. And all right, so again, I'm going to just try to center this up, and I've got her directly in the middle. Sometimes you want to do like rule of thirds where she's off to the side, or this side. In this case, I do like having her in the exact center of the image. And I do want to leave a little bit of room for the gradient that I'm going to add in here later. Sorry, my voice keeps cutting out because I do so much talking during the week. I am going to increase the width of this a tiny bit and make sure I get that top light in there because I do think that looks pretty cool. And I'm going to go with about right there for now. I can always come back and scale and crop it down more if I want to later. So actually I'm going to hit Control-Z, and I apologize, I don't want to take too much time on the crop, but I don't want to have too much going on below the feet. So let's make sure that we have this as we want it. So let's go with right there. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'll hold Control and zoom in a bit. And now I'll just scale this down. So I'll just go to Image, Scale Image, and let me just set the resolution at 300. And I'm going to set the height, the max height, to 1920. And I'll just hit Scale. And actually make sure your interpolation is set to no halo, and I'll hit Scale. And Marco, thanks for joining from Montenegro. It's always awesome to hear when you guys are joining from around the world. I love having this channel be an international channel, an inclusive channel as well. All right, so we've scaled it down. I think I may have not done a great job of making sure there's an even amount of head space to space below. And let me just reference the, this was the original image. So what I can do towards the end is I'll crop out some below her feet. So for now, I'm just going to leave this as is, and just for the sake of moving on. But the next tool I'm going to use is my Shadows Highlights tool. I'll hold Control and zoom in a bit here. And you can also click this icon right here, and that will frame your image so that it fits exactly within your canvas window. But I'm going to go to Colors, Shadows Highlights, and now I'm going to play around with the shadows and highlights a bit. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to recover some of the details like up top here, because there is some cool architecture with this bridge, and any other details within the image that I want to bring out. So I think going with around 45 is probably best for now, and then now I'll move on to my highlights. So the highlights are like below her feet here, and probably the lights themselves, and maybe her face a little bit, but I don't want to overdo the highlights, so especially for this photo, because there's not a whole lot of important stuff happening in the highlights. And let me actually just bring this down to 40 and see how that looks. And now I'm just going to shift the white point a little bit. And Robinson, thank you for joining me from Peru. That is awesome. I have some connections to Peru. So definitely a big fan of the Peruvians. And, you know, I was rooting for the Peru national team to do well in the World Cup, but, you know, unfortunately they stopped short there. All right, so I've turned the white point up a little bit, and that is helping to just brighten up the image overall. And now I'm going to work on the radius and the compression, so I'm just going to sort of do what I usually do, which is going back and forth and seeing which one I like better. I think having the radius up a little bit better works for me. And then maybe compress it a little bit more. So there's a before, there's an after. We still have much to do here, but I'm going to go with that for now. And thank you, Kenan, for joining us from Sweden. I'm going to click OK. That's probably one of the highest compliments I've got to say that I've ever gotten. Kenan says that he wants to point out that my videos have a real Bob Ross feel to them for him. That is freaking awesome. I just want to say that because I love Bob Ross. And that is great to hear. And I'm getting a notification up here that my video output is possibly not smooth. And maybe you guys are experiencing some buffering. Let me know if you guys are having a lot of trouble with the live stream. Hello, Paige. Thanks for joining us. And all right, so now I'm going to move on to the color balance portion. So I'll go to colors, color balance. And now I'm just going to play around. So in this case, when I add cyan, I think because there's already so much blue and cyan in this image, it really just does not do a great job. So it just brings out too much of that cyan and it becomes overwhelming. But really when we go the other way with red, I mean, we do have red in the image, like I said the building, and then even parts of her complexion there kind of have some red in them. But I don't want to overdo the red because I don't want it to look like, I mean, that looks ridiculous right there. So we want to, you know, take it easy with the red. Let me just do 1.0 here. And Sam, I have visited that website. I haven't in a while just because, you know, I like my own personal knowledge base now. But I do tend to go there sometimes. And it can be a good place to get answers if you need them. And Paige, thank you for that feedback. Same with you, Ano. And Al, yeah, if you're going into a tunnel, that's probably why it would be buffering on your end. All right, so I'm going to try a little bit of blue here. The blue doesn't look as bad as the cyan does, so I might actually stick with having some blue in the midtones here. I'm going to move on to the shadows. And the cyan doesn't look as bad when we add it to the shadows, but I still think we can do better by adding red. So I will do that. And magenta looks pretty good too, but I don't want to do too much. You guys will probably know by now or have noticed by now that I like to make very minute adjustments with the color balance tool. That's mostly because, you know, I like to make sure that everything is properly color balanced in the camera ahead of time. Because anytime you add too much color in the editing process, it can look kind of fake. So I like to make sure everything's color balanced properly ahead of time and then make very minor adjustments inside of the photo editor. And in this case, I think a little bit of yellow looks better in the highlights. Here's a before, here's an after. So again, very minute adjustments, and I'll click OK. Thanks for the feedback, Victor. Next up, we're going to dive into the levels tool. So this, again, will help with the brightness and contrast of the image. Alberto, thanks for joining from Colombia. And hello, Joe. Thanks for joining us. So now I'm going to adjust the levels here using these sliders. And this one right here represents the shadows. Then we've got the midtones, and then we've got the highlights. So I'm going to bring the highlights up a bit. I'm not going to overdo it. You'll see that her face starts to look blown out and overexposed when we bring it up too much. So I'm keeping an eye on that. And her face was pretty bright because of that flash. So, you know, we don't want to sort of bring that out too much because we don't want an overexposed face in the photo. And then there are a lot of midtones in here, especially towards the center of the image. So we do want to bring out some of those midtone details, but not too much because we don't want to start having a bunch of noise in here. And Gio, that's awesome to hear. You know, I actually really appreciate the admins and the work they do because, you know, a lot of times they are sort of on a volunteer basis. And, you know, my dad actually does a lot of work in open source, and he's not necessarily an admin, but he's a big contributor to a lot of coding sites. And I know that he just kind of does it for the love of open source and the love of coding. So I really appreciate, you know, the admins and the big contributors to forums. You know, you guys put in a lot of time just to simply help people out and help them solve whatever issues they're having. So appreciate that. And all right, that looks good. So I'll click OK. And all right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work on the saturation here. So I'll go to Colors, Saturation. And for you guys new to the live tutorials, I do occasionally pause and just read comments. So if you hear me drop off for a second or two, that's usually why. So now I'm going to turn the saturation up a bit on this image. I don't always increase the saturation in my images, but in this case, I think the colors look better when you bring them out versus when you tone them down. I think when you tone them down, there's so much gray, with the concrete and everything, that the model's face and everything starts to get lost behind that. And so in this case, I want to bring out her features by turning up the colors. All right, Joe, thanks for checking in here. And yeah, I hope you watch the video. Once it's all finished up and the recording is made available. They're always made available after the live sessions are over. They just have to process on YouTube. It takes a couple minutes. But yeah, you guys can always check out the live streams at any time on the YouTube channel. There's a section actually on the actual page on our YouTube channel homepage, youtube.com/daviesmediadesign, that it's called Live Sessions, and you'll find all of our live session tutorials on there. All right, so I'm going to go with that. Click OK. Next up, I'm going to do the color temperature. And yes, Paige, so I got a question here. Am I going to make all my adjustments on one layer? Yeah, so in GIMP, they don't have adjustment layers yet, like in Photoshop. So, everything just applies to the layer that you're working on. And there's not really a way to get around that for now. So yeah, usually all of the photo edits just go on the one layer. I mean, there are cases when you can create a new layer and make the edits on that new layer, and then change the layer mode to help it blend with the layer below. But yeah, for now, all of the edits happen on a single layer, and I actually didn't keep the original to sort of compare, but I'll open up the original at the end here and show you guys. But yeah, all the edits go on one layer now. I know the GIMP team is working on it for 3.0. Yeah, layer masks don't work for image adjustments, so you can't put a layer mask on here and then only make the image adjustments to that. I mean, I could create a new layer if I wanted to. For example, turn up the saturation only on the model. I could use the selection tool to cut her out, add that selection to a layer mask, and then increase the saturation on that layer. But yeah, usually when I'm editing my photos, I do my corrections to everything in the image, unless I'm trying to do something artsy. So thanks for joining from Alabama. I've got a friend from Alabama, or a couple friends from Alabama actually, and they're Alabama fans. And I went to UCF, so I'm a UCF fan, so that's always pretty funny for those of you who follow college football in America. And I appreciate you saying that you love our vids. Appreciate that. All right, so moving on, I'm going to go to color temperature now. So colors, color temperature. And I always keep the original temperature set to the default. And so when I increase this, it's going to warm it up. And when I decrease the temperature, it'll cool it off. I think it looks a little bit better warmed up. That is usually the case, or that's usually the setting that I like. the question becomes, how much do you want to turn it up in order to get the look that you want? And in this case, I think 7,500 is too much. 7,250 is pretty close. Let's try 7,000. That looks pretty good too. I'm actually going to go in between and go 7,150, which is a pretty weird number, but that looks pretty good. I'm like hesitant to apply this because I'm kind of in between here. I think that's a bit much. Let's go 7,200. And that looks pretty good, so I'll click OK. It might be a little on the warm side, but I think it looks all right. And next up, I'm going to do the curve. So I'm going to go to Colors, Curves, and I'm going to do my usual creating a point right here in the middle of the curve, and then I'm going to click and drag this portion of the curve down, and this is going to be my shadows area. Over here are my highlights, so I'll click and drag these up. And now we've added some contrast there by creating an S-curve. Something I want to do is there's a bit too much black pixels going on in here, so I'm going to click on this bottom one here and just drag it up, and you'll see that as I do that, it's going to take some of the contrast out. So it's almost like shifting the black point of the image, I suppose. I don't know if that's actually the proper way to describe what's happening there. But if I do it with this one, you can see that's actually not creating the effect I want. So I'm going to click and drag this point right here a little bit down on this portion of the graph here. So that's going to decrease the contrast and the saturation. And you can see we're still adding contrast here, just not as much. So we're kind of toning it down a bit, and that's helping this look a little bit better. So I'll click OK. And I appreciate you, GeoSam, sharing my videos on GIMP chat about the layer modes. I appreciate that, and I'm glad you liked it. And I actually used to share my own videos on the forums, and then I guess they weren't big fans of me doing that, so I haven't done that in many years. But I used to try to share my videos to help people out, and then they sort of thought I was spamming them, so decided to quit doing that. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing it. I'm sure when admins share it, it looks a lot better than when I share it. So, all right, next I'm going to hold Control and zoom in here, and we're going to use the airbrush tool to work on her complexion. The main thing I'm going to do here, and you can see when I zoom in, because I did scale this down, there's not a ton of detail left in here because this isn't the original large image. If I were working on the larger image, we would have a bit more detail here. But what I'm going to do is grab my airbrush tool, and I want to get rid of some of the flash that is bouncing off her face. And so I'm just going to, right now my opacity is set to around 50%, and I have a pretty soft brush set here. So hold Control and click to grab a color near the area where I want to paint. And then I'm just going to paint over this little spot right here. I'm actually going to try to use the heal tool first, because I think that might be a better tool in this case. Yeah, so that did a little bit better of a job. And I'm going to turn the opacity down of this because I don't want to paint too much of the color on the spot that we're trying to fix. And I'm going to increase my brush size using the brackets on my keyboard. The right bracket is going to increase your brush size. And then I'm just going to use this heal tool to get rid of some of the areas, the reflections on her face caused by the flash. So that looks pretty good. And I'm just going to do some light airbrushing up here on her forehead. And glad to hear that, GeoSam. I'm glad it saved you some time and some work. I actually put a ton of time into that tutorial, and because GIMP's knowledge base and its manuals have a lot of holes in it when it comes to the layer mode, so I had to do a lot of independent research to be able to dive into some of the details on how those layer masks worked. So had to sort of scour the corners of the internet to find some of that information, so I'm glad you found it useful. All right, so I think that looks pretty good. As you guys know, I don't like to go completely overboard with the airbrushing. So I'm going to hold Control and zoom out a bit here just to kind of see how this looks. So that looks pretty satisfactory, I would say. And all right, so the next thing I'm going to do, and I should hit this icon here. Sometimes it doesn't work. There we go. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sharpen this up a little bit. So I'm going to go over to Filters, Light and Shadow. Oh, I'm sorry, Filters, Enhance, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. And so you guys can play around with these settings as per usual and see what looks better. If you turn the radius up too much, you could see it almost creates like hard, almost like black lines around all the detailed parts of your image. But if you turn it down too much, it doesn't sharpen it enough. So that's why I usually stick with the 3.0, the default setting, because that's usually a sufficient amount of sharpening. You can play around with the amount as well. And in this case, I think we could turn it up just a tiny bit. Probably not that much, actually. I'll just go 0.550. So there's a before, there's an after. And I'm actually just going to keep this on the default. I think if I mess with it, it's going to be too much. So I'll click OK. And now we've got a nice sharpened image here. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add the layer with the color, and we're going to use the layer mode to blend it with the layer below. So I'm going to come over here and create a new layer. I'm going to name this red gradient. Make sure my fill width is set to transparency. You can always add color tags. I kind of stopped mentioning that in my last several tutorials. But I can always, let's say for all of the vignettes and the gradients, I want them to have color tags so they can be associated with one another. So I'll give this a red color tag. I'm going to keep the layer mode set to normal for now. We're going to adjust the layer mode itself later. So now you can see I've got my red color tag here. And again, we have a red building here. So the whole point of this is to just sort of, instead of having yellow down here, blue up here, and then red over here, I'm going to try to do red down here, and then blue up here. So I'm going to grab my gradient tool right here, and I'm going to come over to my foreground color, and I'm just going to click and drag this all the way up to the top right. So this is that red, pure 100 red primary color, and I'll click OK. Excuse me. And then I'm going to come over here to the actual gradient itself, and I'm going to come down to foreground and transparent. And I'm going to make sure my shape is set to linear. And now what I'll do, you can hold Control and zoom out a bit, is I'm going to click and drag while holding the Control key to make sure this is drawing in straight line mode. And I'm going to drag this and release about right here. So now we have this red gradient. Obviously, this is way too strong. So what I can do is I can play around with my layer modes. In this case, I had already played around with this, but I went with overlay first. I thought that's still too strong. Then I went with soft light, so I thought that toned it down a bit. And as GeoSam mentioned earlier on the chat, I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to all 38 layer modes, so I'll see if I can link that. I mean, I can definitely link that in the description of the video after I'm done here. But that will help you guys understand what all the layer modes do. There's a ton of them in here, as you can see. And so I go over what each individual layer mode does. And so now I've got this set to soft light. It's still a little bit strong. I'll hold Control and zoom in. So the whole point of this is just to, again, make this light down here. Instead of having it look yellow, we're trying to make it look more red so that it blends better with this. I'm going to, first off, play around with the location of this. So if I drag it all the way up to about here, it's going to go all the way back to almost the very back of this light. The reason I'm not going any further is because it's going to start hitting her face, and I don't want to make her face look all red. Something else I want to do, though, is I want to decrease the opacity of this because I don't want it being so strong. So I'm just going to play around until there's just a tinge of red really going on down here. So I think about right there looks good. So there's a before. So that looks kind of dull, not super interesting or dynamic. And then there's an after. So this just helps, the colors match sort of what's going on and, create more accent colors in here. So you can always click on here and adjust the midpoint of the gradient. You could drag this up if you want so that there's more red coming through here. Or you could just keep it sort of low like this, which is what I like to do because I like to have a nice gradual gradient going on here. But once you're ready, make sure you're clicked on the gradient and then hit the Enter key, and that'll apply the gradient. So now we've got this nice red color going on at the bottom here. And Paige, I'm glad you're enjoying the tutorial. So next up, I'm going to create another new layer, and this one's going to be for our vignette. So I'll just type vignette here. And again, you could set your color tag if you want. Make sure that the fill width is set to transparency and click OK. And now I'm going to come over to Filters, Light and Shadow, and Vignette. This brings up our Vignette tool. Right now, this vignette is sort of, it's closing in too much on our model, and that's not what we want. We want to frame the model with the vignette, but we don't want it to like overtake her. So what I can do is I can increase the radius to draw it out a bit, give her a little bit more room. If you want the radius to, squeeze the model a bit more, be a little bit closer, you can decrease the squeeze here in this case because she's, a pretty tall and narrow object in the photo. So we can turn the squeeze down a bit. You can see now it kind of follows her a little bit better. And we can adjust the softness and the gamma to keep too much black from spilling into the image. So if I turn the gamma up and the softness, adjust the softness here, you can see that that has pulled out some of the black, so it's sort of pushed it further back. I'm actually going to increase the radius a tiny bit because right now it's a bit too close to her still. So we can go with about right there. And I'll click OK. And now we can just decrease the opacity of this. And I think one issue here that I've sort of created on accident is by decreasing the softness too much and the gamma, it's created too hard of a line there. So I could go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just sort of blur this a bit to blur those edges there. And you can see that happening there. Click OK. And also just maybe turn the vignette down a bit. You never want the vignette to be noticeable really in the photo. You just want it to sort of be very, very faint there. The whole goal is to just sort of darken what's going on the outside, frame the photo, and bring the eyes inward. I'm actually going to turn down my red a little bit as well because I do want this to be just barely visible also, sort of like the vignette. All right, so I'm going to cheat here and just compare this to the old photo. So here was the old photo. I had a little bit more blue in here versus the new photo. I've got a little bit more yellow and probably a little bit more red. But there's that final photo. Let me just turn this down a little bit more just so there's a touch of red. All right, so you guys can export this by going to File, Export As, and you can name the image whatever you want. And let me just name this Bridge Rhino Live Stream Edit. And you can select your file type down here. I just went with JPEG. In my print tutorial that I put out before this one, I mentioned if you go with TIFF, it's going to be less compressed, so there'll be more details. But if you're using this for the web, it's going to take up more space. So for the web, you typically want to use something like a JPEG. Then you can adjust the quality here. I'll just go all the way up to 100. If you're putting your image on a website, go with something like 60 or 75. Hit export. And there you go. All right, guys, so thanks for joining me for this live tutorial. You can check out my YouTube videos at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. You can visit our website at daviesmediadesign.com. And you can also enroll in our GIMP photo editing course from beginner to pro photo retoucher on Udemy. And you can support our channel and help us grow by becoming a patron on Patreon. And I'll include a link to that as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. As always, guys, thanks for supporting the channel. Thanks for watching these live tutorials. I'm having a ton of fun doing them. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.